An extremely dangerous criminal is terrifying, but a criminal who is skilled at disguise is even more so, because you never know what thoughts lie behind that smiling face. An extremely dangerous criminal will reveal their twisted mind, but a criminal who is good at disguise can hide those dark thoughts, showing only a gentle and harmless side. Such people are often more evil than the former. The story takes place in Los Angeles, California. Located in the southwestern part of California, Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States and is often referred to as the City of Angels. According to FBI research, in 1990, the combined murder rates of New York and Los Angeles accounted for 13.8% of all murders in the United States. In the 1970s, serial killer Rodney James Alcala murdered at least 9 women and girls across the country, though the true number of deaths is likely over 100. He was imprisoned for sexual assault but continued to rape and kill after being released. Autopsies of some victims revealed that he would strangle the women until they lost consciousness, then wait for them to regain consciousness before ultimately killing them. On July 24, 2021, Rodney James Alcala, known as the dating game killer, died at a hospital near a California prison at the age of 77. Rodney earned the nickname Dating Game Killer after appearing on the reality TV show The Dating Game in 1978. In 1980, he was sentenced to death for the murder of 12-year-old Robin Christine Samso. In 1984, the California Supreme Court overturned the conviction and Rodney's murder case was retried. In 1986, Rodney was sentenced to death for the second time for the murder of Samso. However, in 2003, the federal appellate court overturned this sentence. In 2010, an Orange County jury convicted Rodney of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The killing of Samso, the 1977 murder of 18-year-old Jill Terry Barcombe and 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wixted, the 1978 murder of 31-year-old Charlotte Lee Lamb, and the 1979 murder of 21-year-old Jill Marie Parenteau. He was sentenced to death for the third time. Rodney was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, in the central United States. He had 2 sisters, and when he was 8 years old, the family moved to Mexico with their father. However, 3 years later, his father abandoned the family, leaving the young Rodney and his sisters to endure a harsh life. Eventually, they had no choice but to move back to the United States with their mother, settling in a suburb of Los Angeles, where they struggled to get by on her meager salary. Rodney was very good-looking from a young age, and the neighbors adored him. He was also smarter than his peers. However, during his teenage years, he began to exhibit a unique personality. He was reclusive, withdrawn, and indifferent to the warmth and care of those around him. In 1961, at the age of 17, Rodney joined the U.S. Army, where he worked in a clerical role. His IQ test score was an impressive 160, far above the average IQ range of 85 to 115, indicating that Rodney was a genius. In 1964, at the age of 21, Rodney was diagnosed with a mental disorder. A psychiatrist in the military later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, also known as sociopathic personality disorder. This condition is characterized by high levels of aggression, a lack of shame, and severe social impact. It typically begins to manifest in childhood or adolescence and can persist into adulthood or throughout a person's life. Due to the severity of his antisocial personality disorder, Rodney was discharged from the Army by military psychiatrists. After his discharge, he used his exceptional abilities to enroll in the UCLA School of Fine Arts. If his life had continued on this path, it could have been remarkable, but in reality his inner world was deeply dark, and he pursued these studies only to better disguise himself. In 1968, Rodney graduated from the School of Fine Arts, and it was from this year that he began his criminal journey. One day, a little girl was about to walk to school when a beige, unlicensed car started following her. A passing driver witnessed the scene and saw the man in the car stop, holding some snacks, and invite the little girl into the vehicle. The passing driver found this suspicious and followed the beige car to an apartment building. Along the way, he called the Los Angeles Police Department to report the strange situation. Coincidentally, a police officer was patrolling Sunset Boulevard at the time, and after receiving the report, he immediately headed to the apartment. When the officer arrived at the apartment, he knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm the police." "Open the door. I need to talk to you." A man appeared at the door with an extremely sinister look on his face. He said, I, I was taking a bath. Give me a moment to get dressed. The officer gave him 10 seconds, but after a few minutes passed with no sound from the door, the officer, sensing something was wrong, kicked it open. After checking the living room and finding no one, he walked into the kitchen. On the floor lay a naked little girl, covered in bruises and with blood still flowing from her head. The kitchen was splattered with blood and marked with drag marks, and a photo of the girl was discarded on the ground. Next to the girl was a metal bar with clear marks of strangulation. The officer initially suspected it was used to strangle the girl into unconsciousness. He checked for her breathing by placing his fingers on her nose but found none. Believing she was dead, he frantically searched the house for the perpetrator, who had already escaped through the window minutes earlier. Returning to the kitchen, the officer noticed that the girl's chest was rapidly rising and falling, indicating she was still trying to breathe. He immediately alerted the Los Angeles Police Department to clear the traffic and transported the girl to the hospital as quickly as possible. After medical examination, it was found that the girl had been repeatedly assaulted and had injuries from the metal bar. Fortunately, after emergency treatment, the girl survived, but remained in a coma for over a month and needed several more months to recover before being discharged. The little girl was 8-year-old Tali Shapiro, a sweet and innocent child. After her release, Tali's parents moved from Los Angeles to Mexico to help her recover psychologically. In an interview later, Tali said, "I don't remember going up to the apartment, and I don't remember anything after that." Meanwhile, a large number of police officers began searching the apartment. They found numerous pieces of photography equipment and a large number of photos, all of which featured young girls. They also discovered the perpetrator's ID card, identifying him as Rodney James Alcala, a student at UCLA. The Los Angeles police then contacted a professor at UCLA to inquire about Rodney. The professor said, "Yes, to us, he seemed like a good person. He would never harm anyone." Meanwhile, Rodney, who had fled, changed his name to John Berger and enrolled in the New York University Tisch School of the Arts, where he studied filmmaking under the renowned French director Roman Polanski. On June 24, 1971, a woman named Cornelia Michael Crilly, a 23-year-old TWA flight attendant, was murdered in her New York neighborhood. She had recently moved to this area, which was known for being home to many flight attendants and secretaries. Her boyfriend, Leon Borstein, described Cornelia as having a beautiful face and a very polished demeanor. On the day of the move, Borstein found her door locked and received no response when he called her. When the police arrived, they discovered a shocking scene. Cornelia was naked, strangled with her own nylon stockings, and had bite marks on her breasts. At the time, New York City had a high murder rate, with nearly 2,000 murders in 1971, making it difficult for the police to solve Cornelia's case. The lack of widespread DNA technology and the absence of any suspects led to the case becoming a cold case. In the same summer that Cornelia was murdered, Rodney obtained a job as a counselor at a children's arts camp in New Hampshire, where he taught kids how to make films. At this time, he was using the alias John Berger. In 1971, 2 campers recognized Rodney, who was wanted by the FBI, and reported him to the police. After his arrest, he was extradited back to California. However, an unexpected complication arose during preparations for his trial. The previous victim, Tali, had moved to Mexico with her family, and her family refused to let her testify in Rodney's trial to protect her privacy. Due to the lack of a key witness, the judge could not convict Rodney and had no choice but to release him. Less than 2 months after his release from prison, Rodney lured a 13-year-old girl to the edge of a cliff and harmed her. This time, with both witnesses and evidence, Rodney was sentenced to 2 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he was again released on parole. After his release from prison, despite his criminal record, Rodney used his charisma and knowledge of art and film to disguise himself as a professional photographer, photographing hundreds of women. Gradually, Rodney used his reputation as a locally known photographer to approach his victims, most of whom were women. He would first incapacitate and subdue them, then torture them until they died in fear, and finally take their earrings as trophies. Rodney's next victim was Ellen Hover, a 23-year-old musician and artist. Ellen was a sweet person with a gentle soul. She came from a prominent entertainment family. Her father owned the famous Hollywood nightclub Ciro's, and her godfathers were Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. On July 15, 1977, Ellen disappeared. When the New York police began their investigation, they found only a calendar note that mentioned she was going to meet someone named John Berger. On November 9, 1977, Rodney lured 18-year-old runaway Jill Terry Barcombe with smooth talk. After engaging in inappropriate behavior, he brutally killed her and left her body on a hillside near Hollywood. To prevent identification, he used rocks to disfigure her face and head, then ended her life using belts, stockings, and pants in 3 separate instances. On December 16, 1977, Rodney committed similar acts against 27-year-old nurse Georgia Marie Wickstead in his Malibu apartment. He struck her head with a hammer, strangled her with stockings, and left her naked in the bathroom. On June 24, 1978, Rodney engaged in inappropriate acts with his legal secretary, 31-year-old Charlotte Lee Lamb, in his apartment. He then beat her and strangled her with shoelaces, leaving her in the laundry room of an apartment building in El Segundo. On September 3, 1978, Rodney appeared on a dating show called The Dating Game. Clearly, the show staff did not thoroughly investigate Rodney's background, as the host introduced him as a successful photographer, skilled in skydiving and motorcycle riding. Many of the female contestants were impressed by his charming smile and smooth talk. Cheryl Bradshaw, Rodney's on-screen date, received an invitation from him after the show, but declined without hesitation. She said, "My intuition told me Rodney was dangerous. He repeatedly suggested spending a special night together, but I felt scared and even got goosebumps." On February 14, 1979, Rodney picked up 15-year-old Monique Hoyt in Riverside County. He drove her to his apartment where they spent some time in the room. The next day, they went to a secluded mountainous area where Rodney took inappropriate photos of her and images of her being harmed. He then bound and gagged her, continuing the assault. While Rodney was in a gas station restroom on the way back to Riverside County, Monique managed to escape and reported the assault to the police. However, Rodney's mother posted his bail. On June 13, 1979, 21-year-old computer operator Jill Marie Parento left work early to attend a baseball game. The next morning, when she failed to show up for work, police visited her Burbank apartment and found signs of forced entry. Jill was discovered dead, naked on the bathroom floor, having been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. On June 20, 1979, 12-year-old Samantha Samso went missing while biking to her ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. 12 days later, police received a tip and discovered Samantha's body on a hillside. Due to the hot weather, the body had decomposed significantly, and the coroner could not determine if she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators later found Samantha's earrings in a storage locker rented by Rodney. Following this lead, Rodney was immediately arrested and charged. However, a woman testified that Rodney had not been to the beach, but police dismissed her testimony, suspecting she might be romantically involved with Rodney and potentially providing false evidence to cover up his crimes. In 1980, Rodney was sentenced to death by the Orange County Superior Court. However, this verdict was overturned by the California Supreme Court due to police misconduct. Specifically, they had informed the jury of his criminal history prematurely, which could have biased their decision. Additionally, the evidence, which consisted of only a single earring, was deemed insufficient to conclusively prove his guilt. In 1986, after new evidence was collected, Rodney was retried and convicted of first-degree murder. In 2001, a U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals panel overturned the death sentence, ruling that a key witness who had discovered the body had not testified in court due to memory issues. The absence of this crucial witness led to another legal stalemate. While in prison, Rodney wrote a book claiming his innocence and sought compensation from the government for his incarceration. By 2003, DNA testing had become a standard tool in criminal investigations. Since the establishment of the first national DNA database in 1995, many countries had followed suit, And by this year, 76 countries had either established or planned to establish DNA databases. DNA analysis revealed that the DNA found at two previous rape scenes in Los Angeles matched Rodney's DNA. Additionally, DNA extracted from an earring found in Rodney's storage locker matched the DNA of the victim, Samso. With this conclusive evidence, Rodney could finally be convicted. Moreover, the police identified Rodney as the perpetrator in 4 additional murder and rape cases: 18-year-old Jill Barcombe, 27-year-old Georgia Wixted, 31-year-old Charlotte Lamb, and 21-year-old Jill Parento. In addition to these confirmed cases, authorities suspected Rodney might be involved in over 100 other murder and rape cases. However, due to the passage of time or lack of critical evidence, these cases could not be pursued further. In 2006, prosecutors brought charges against Rodney for the newly confirmed 4 murder cases, along with the previously known Samso murder case. The California Supreme Court approved the prosecution. In February 2010, Rodney faced trial for the 3rd time, this time for 5 counts of murder. The 5 victims had all been sexually assaulted and then killed. This trial saw Rodney defending himself without a lawyer. During the trial, Rodney demonstrated his high intelligence and psychological composure, responding to questions with a calm and detached demeanor, even joking and smiling in court. Over the course of 5 hours, he played multiple roles in the case, even engaging in self-questioning and answering. However, despite his eloquence, he could not refute the overwhelming DNA evidence. Additionally, the then 8-year-old victim Tali courageously testified in court. Seeing no way out, Rodney ceased his defense and ultimately requested the judge not to sentence him to death, a request that was not granted. In 2010, the New York police released 215 photographs taken by Rodney, hoping to identify unknown victims. The photos showed women ranging from their teens to their 30s, from various states across the U.S. Many families recognized their missing loved ones among the images. The police also had over 900 more photos that were not released due to privacy concerns. In 2016, Rodney was also implicated in the 1977 murder of Christine Ruth Thornton in Wyoming, but prosecutors chose not to extradite him for trial. Additionally, police suspected him of killing Pamela Lamson in the San Francisco Bay Area in the fall of 1977. However, the DNA collected from that crime scene was too degraded to test, so no charges were filed. Rodney died on July 24, 2021, while awaiting execution in California at the age of 77. Perhaps around us, there are some antisocial personalities quietly hiding. Studies suggest that 1 in every 25 people may have such traits, a proportion that seems surprisingly high. Fortunately, most of these individuals are not murderers and do not commit such violent acts. They are unburdened by emotions, clever and manipulative, with unpredictable personalities but without anxiety. They are skilled at disguise and approach problems with calm, clarity, and organization. Although they are fully aware of societal norms, they are indifferent to them. In reality, their pursuit is solely for their own goals, and they are willing to use any means necessary to achieve them. People often say that the law is the most powerful weapon against criminals. However, in history, there was a serial killer who, under the protection of the law, cruelly took the lives of dozens of young girls. The victims' families mournfully called for him a severe or long-term sentence, but because the highest penalty in that country was only 16 years, the killer was ultimately sentenced to just 16 years in prison. In other words, for each innocent life he took, his sentence was extended by only 2 months. On an evening in May 1985, the police station in Guayaquil Port, the capital of Guayas province in Ecuador, received a report from a woman who said her daughter was missing. Her name was Ana, and her missing daughter was named Marta. Since her husband had passed away, Ana had been struggling to raise her children by selling fruit at the market. The police chief, Edward Gonzalez, sympathized with this hardworking woman and personally took her detailed statement. Ana said, In the morning, Marta was helping me pack bags for customers. When there were fewer customers, she went with some friends to play at a nearby flower shop. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a few hours, I couldn't find her anywhere. I asked her friends, but they said they hadn't seen her. Anna recounted the events of the disappearance in fragments, but since Marta had been missing for less than 24 hours and it was nearing the end of the workday, Edward didn't know what to do. If the girl wasn't actually missing, it would only add unnecessary burden. Seeing Edward's silence and frown, the distressed Anna guessed he might not want to help and broke down in tears. Reluctantly, Edward agreed to help. He said they could first check the market, and then he and Anna left the police station together. Half an hour later, they walked to the market, where a group of ragged children were selling pens, cigarettes, and lighters to passers-by. Anna took Edward to a short, plump Indian woman with black hair, who was the owner of the flower shop where Marta was last seen playing. The shop owner told Edward that around 10 a.m., Marta was indeed playing with her 2 children in the shop, but as many customers came in, she didn't pay much attention to Marta's whereabouts. After hearing this, Edward spoke with nearby children, who said the last time they saw Marta, she was talking to a man selling pencils, who was about 5 feet tall with light brown skin and black hair. Since they were busy playing hide and seek, they didn't continue watching Marta, and she disappeared from view at that time. Edward wondered if Marta might have fallen asleep after hiding for too long while playing hide and seek. He reassured the anxious Anna, though he had a growing sense of unease because prior to Marta's disappearance, several girls in the area had already gone missing. However, behind all of this was a boy's life shaped by his parents' neglect and unfair treatment. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born on January 22, 1930, into a wealthy family in the town of Anolaima in the Colombian Andes. His father, Daniel Camargo Briceño, was a businessman, and his mother, Teresa Barbosa, was his father's second wife. Camargo had a half-sister from his father's first marriage. When Camargo was 2 years old, his mother passed away, and his father soon remarried. Camargo was very intelligent and performed excellently at school, with an IQ rated at 116. However, whenever Camargo tried to connect with his father, regardless of the topic, his father would tell him that he was worthless and a hopeless case. Eventually, Camargo lost interest in communicating with his father. Due to his father's emotional distance and greater interest in business than in family, Camargo's childhood was mainly influenced by his stepmother, Dioselina Fernandez. Fernandez, who married at a young age, was obsessed with having a daughter. When she discovered she was unable to have children, her obsession grew stronger. She doted on her stepdaughter while treating her stepson unfairly. Fernandez would punish Camargo by taking away his pants, forcing him to wear girls' clothing, and inviting his schoolmates to watch him in these clothes. These punishments destroyed his social standing at school, making him a target for bullying. From then on, Camargo developed a deep hatred for women and anything associated with femininity. Returning to Marta's disappearance, Edward may have still harbored some hope, as there had never been severe violent incidents in the area before. However, his concerns soon became reality when one of the most horrifying and brutal serial murder cases in Ecuador's history began to unfold, casting a pervasive and indescribable fear over the small, otherwise obscure South American town for years to come. After returning home, Anna did not find her daughter. Over the next 3 weeks, Edward's small police station received reports of 2 more missing girls, aged 8 and 9, with their disappearances also occurring near the same market. Even more bizarrely, starting from the day after Anna's report, the police organized patrols around the market and interviewed dozens of shop owners, indicating that these girls disappeared under police surveillance. The situation became even more alarming with a new report. A middle-aged man called in to report that he had discovered the body of a girl by the roadside. This suggested that the missing girls might have been murdered. A middle-aged man called in, trembling as he reported that he and a few friends, after finishing a vacation in Playas County and heading home, had their car break down 2 miles south of Guayaquil. As he attempted to open the hood of the car, he noticed something bulging and round in the roadside ditch. Initially thinking it was discarded rags, he realized upon closer inspection that it was the body of a girl. Upon hearing this, Edward called the coroner and arranged for an ambulance and a tow truck. By 5 p.m., the police arrived at the scene, set up a perimeter, and after making some adjustments, Edward led the way past the barrier to investigate. As Edward approached the body, he noticed that the head was completely destroyed. Minutes later, the coroner arrived and, after an initial examination, determined that the girl had been dead for over 2 weeks. Based on the dirt on the clothes and bite marks on the body, it appeared she had been dug up from a shallow grave by wild dogs. After transporting the body to the morgue, the coroner told Edward, "I have been a forensic pathologist for 15 years, and this case is the most shocking I have encountered. I cannot imagine the level of hatred required to commit such a brutal act. This is the most savage individual I have ever encountered." In the early 1940s, Briceño sent Camargo to a prestigious all-boys Catholic boarding school. Camargo excelled academically once again, but his plans for further education were interrupted due to financial difficulties faced by the family during a period of violence. Forced to drop out, Camargo took a job as a door-to-door salesman. In 1957, he began a relationship with a young client, Alcira Castillo, and after a few dates, persuaded her to rent an apartment together. However, the cost of dating was higher than he anticipated, leading him to attempt to rob another client's store on May 24, 1958, to make ends meet. He was arrested just hours later and sent to a low-security prison for petty theft. The prison's security was lax, allowing Camargo to simply take a writing board from a desk, pretend to be busy, and walk out with the changing guards, continuing his life as if nothing had happened. In 1962, Camargo met another woman, Esperanza, and fell in love with her to the extent that he decided to leave Castillo despite having 2 children with her. After becoming engaged to Esperanza, he discovered she was not a virgin and later found her in bed with another man. Returning to Marta's disappearance, the police conducted a thorough search around the site where the girl's body was discovered, but unfortunately found little evidence. They did recover a crumpled candy wrapper from a bush less than 2 meters from the grave, which they suspected might have been left by the perpetrator, and carefully placed it in a plastic bag to take back to the station. The next morning, several parents of missing children received calls from the police to come and identify the body. When Anna saw the blue dress, she broke down in hysterical tears, recognizing it as the dress her daughter had been wearing when she disappeared. That afternoon, Edward contacted the police in Quito, the capital, to check if any criminals had escaped from prison. He also had the photos of the missing girls published in newspapers in Guayaquil, Quito, Esmeraldas, and other major Ecuadorian cities, hoping to gather more information. Soon, Captain Pablo Andrade from the Quito Police Department returned the call, reporting that 3 months prior, a 10-year-old girl had mysteriously disappeared in their jurisdiction. Her body was only found 2 weeks ago in a shallow grave. She had been assaulted and killed with a large knife, and the perpetrator was still at large with no witnesses. The girl had been an orphan from an orphanage in Ambato, selling lottery tickets at the weekly Indian markets in Quito to make a few sucres. The similarities in the method of operation, but the wide geographic distance between the crime scenes alarmed the Ecuadorian police. If it was indeed the same perpetrator, they were dealing with someone whose identity was unknown and potentially untraceable, making it even more challenging to pinpoint the suspect and predict their next move. Due to Camargo's strong psychological issues, when he discovered that Esperanza was not a virgin, he initially wanted to end the engagement. However, he found himself unable to do so. Instead, Camargo used his manipulative skills to convince Esperanza to make amends by providing him with a virgin, so he could take her place in taking their virginity. After Esperanza agreed, she brought 5 young girls to their apartment and drugged them to make them unconscious, allowing Camargo to harm them while they were in a state of unconsciousness. This continued until 1964, when their 5th victim became aware of what was happening and recognized them, leading to their arrest. Camargo was initially sentenced to 3 years in prison, but another judge increased the sentence to 8 years. Camargo, feeling like a victim himself, resolved that the next time he assaulted a girl, he would also kill her. After serving his sentence, he was released and moved to Brazil. However, in 1973, he was arrested for illegal immigration and deported back to Colombia. In Colombia, Camargo began working as a street vendor, selling televisions and monitors. On May 2, 1974, Camargo, walking in front of a school in Barranquilla, saw a 9-year-old girl he found attractive. He lured her to a secluded spot, strangled her, and left her body along with a television he was transporting. The next day, Camargo returned to handle the body and retrieve the television, but was caught by a suspicious officer who had been tracking him. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years of isolation on Gorgona Island, located 35 kilometers off Colombia's Pacific coast. After 10 years of imprisonment, Camargo accidentally discovered a kayak on the beach. He immediately jumped in and paddled continuously until he reached the mainland several hours later. The prison reported him as a fugitive, but authorities believed he had died at sea, thinking that an inexperienced person could not navigate such dangerous waters. The media even reported stories of Camargo being eaten by sharks. In reality, Camargo had studied ocean currents, read navigation books, and learned precise positioning in the years before his escape. Once on shore, he headed south towards the Ecuadorian border, marking the beginning of Ecuador's nightmare. In the following 2 months, Edward was unable to obtain any information about the perpetrator. By October 1985, the situation had worsened, with more and more girls mysteriously disappearing, and local residents discovering additional bodies. The bodies of girls were found in various locations: a garbage bin on Santay Island, a farm in Taura, a pile of trash on the outskirts of Guayaquil, a sewage ditch in Azogues, buried in desolate fields in a small village in Riobamba, on a riverbank in Suscal, and on a roadside in Bouquet. There was no doubt that these girls had been harmed, many having been tortured to death. Each discovery was a torment for the Ecuadorian police. To better understand the perpetrator, Edward consulted a local psychologist. The psychologist speculated that the killer was mentally disturbed, but likely intelligent and cautious. Such individuals often have a history of abuse or neglect before the age of 5, which fosters deep-seated hatred that manifests in extreme violence as adults. They derive pleasure from killing, and each crime intensifies their desire to kill. They often feel inadequate and thus target weaker victims to achieve psychological balance. Typically, these individuals do not forcibly abduct victims, but lure them to secluded places using deceitful methods, with candy being a common tool for enticement. Indeed, candy wrappers had been found at the scenes of the discovered bodies, including Marta's. Edward believed that the killer used fruit candies to lure the girls. He sent the candy wrappers to the University of Quito for analysis. Unfortunately, due to the limited technology of the time, no fingerprints were recovered from the candy wrappers. The case was stalled until early February 1986, when a 12-year-old girl named Gloria Andino was found dead in a mangrove swamp. She had also been brutally harmed, with her face unrecognizable like Marta's. However, she was clutching a candy wrapper tightly in her hand. This discovery invigorated the police. Although the previous candy wrappers had deteriorated, making the fingerprints unusable, this new wrapper was carefully preserved by the girl. It was a crucial lead. The wrapper was quickly sent to the Quito laboratory, where a partial fingerprint was extracted from the corner. The fingerprint was then sent to Chicago for further analysis. After several hours of processing, a complete fingerprint from the right index finger was obtained. The following day, Quito police sent copies to major cities in Ecuador and Colombia for comparison. Soon they received matches from Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, and Barranquilla, a northern port city in Colombia. A detailed comparison confirmed that these fingerprints matched the one obtained from the candy wrapper. The fingerprint belonged to Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Camargo's first stop in Ecuador was the capital city, Quito, in the Andes. However, on the cold night of December 5, 1984, he decided to return to the coast. A few days later, on December 18th, Camargo abducted and killed a 9-year-old girl in Quevedo, Ecuador. Between 1984 and 1986, he continued his spree, committing at least 55 murders of young girls and adult women. Most of these murders occurred in Guayas province, but he also committed crimes in Quito, Machala, and Ambato. During this period, Camargo supported himself by working as a porter in the markets of Guayaquil or by selling clothes and belongings taken from his victims. Initially, the police believed the murders were linked to organized crime. Numerous rumors pointed to white slave trafficking rings, satanic cults, or powerful individuals protected by the police. There was no doubt that the man named Camargo was the perpetrator of the serial murders. With this crucial lead, Edward was overjoyed. A few days later, even better news arrived. While Edward was reviewing Camargo's files at the police station, newly assigned Quito police officer Juan Rosales was walking down a muddy road leading to the outskirts of the mangrove swamps. He noticed a middle-aged man furtively emerging from dense bushes carrying a black plastic bag. Rosales parked his car at the roadside and approached the man. The man, disheveled but with a calm demeanor, introduced himself as Manuel Burgalin Solis and answered Rosales' questions with a smile. When Rosales checked the black plastic bag, he found a dirty pair of blue jeans, seemingly belonging to a young girl, and a photograph of the girl in the jeans' pocket. "Whose belongings are these?" Rosales asked with growing suspicion. "They belong to my daughter. I picked them up from a classmate's house. She stayed over there a few days ago and forgot to bring the jeans back, so I went to retrieve them." The man answered calmly. Despite the man's seemingly harmless appearance and his composed responses, Rosales was thrilled and nearly burst into cheers on the street. The girl in the photo, Guadalupe Herrera, had been featured prominently on the front pages of Ecuadorian newspapers for months. The previous night's Quito TV report had highlighted her as one of the missing girls. Rosales was certain that this unkempt man with a slight eye problem was the serial killer who had shocked Ecuador. Before Camargo could react, Rosales swiftly subdued him, handcuffed him, and put him in a police car. After a quick verification by the Quito police, Camargo was transferred overnight to the Guayaquil police station. Initially, Camargo denied being the serial killer, but Edward did not believe his claims. After threatening him with harsh measures, Camargo quickly confessed to his crimes under the pressure. Camargo was a killer who exclusively targeted females, particularly young girls. His preferred victims were often from poor backgrounds, such as farm workers, maids, and students transitioning from elementary to higher education. He would approach his victims under the pretense of being a foreigner looking for a new pastor at a church in the suburbs. With his education, Camargo spoke fluent English and Portuguese, which made his lies more convincing. He would offer small rewards like money, candy, or pens to entice the girls to take him to the church. For older girls or women, he used the promise of work at the church to lure them. The actual murders usually took place in remote, forested areas that required a bus ride to reach. Once in the woods, Camargo would walk a distance, hide in the vegetation, and claim he was familiar with the area and knew a shortcut to their destination. If a victim became suspicious and refused to follow him, Camargo would not try to force them, but would instead look for new victims. If his lure was successful, Camargo would use a knife to threaten the victim and kill them in secluded areas using various methods. After killing, he would steal the victim's clothing and any valuables and leave the body for scavengers to consume. He always carried a spare shirt to change into, leaving behind the blood-stained clothes. He would wash the blood off his hands using urine. Camargo paid close attention to details about his victims, including scars, tattoos, and moles. Occasionally, he even obtained their family members' phone numbers and taunted them after the crimes. After briefly confessing to his crimes, Camargo led the police to various crime scenes. In a swampy redwood forest on the outskirts of Guayaquil, he pointed out several small mounds of dirt, confessing that they contained the bodies of his victims. When the police dug up the mounds, they discovered over a dozen highly decomposed bodies, many of which were missing limbs. Camargo then guided the police to additional locations in Guayaquil and Quito, where they found 9 more bodies. By November 1989, during the trial, he had confessed to 16 cases, and the police, following his directions, found the bodies of victims in 5 cities near Quito. In total, Ecuadorian authorities found 55 bodies of young girls within Ecuador, and with the additional cases in Colombia, the total number of discovered remains reached 71. Camargo had brutally killed 72 young lives. However, these were not all of Camargo's crimes. There were many missing vagrants and cases where the crimes could not be confirmed, which he himself could not fully remember. The chief prosecutor of Guayas province, in a TV interview, assured the public that the strictest punishment would be imposed on Camargo. Unfortunately, Camargo was ultimately sentenced to only 16 years, which was the maximum penalty in Ecuador at that time. On November 13, 1994, while sitting in his cell, Camargo was attacked by a new inmate, 29-year-old Giovanni Alcesio Noguera Jaramillo. Noguera forced Camargo to kneel and, after declaring, "The time for revenge has come," stabbed him 8 times, killing him. He also cut off one of Camargo's ears as a trophy. Noguera showed the ear to the guards, claiming that his family was one of Camargo's victims and that he had sought revenge for them. With no one coming forward to claim Camargo's body, he was buried in a public grave at El Batan Cemetery in Quito. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. This case highlights a broader issue. In countries with less severe penalties, the frequency and brutality of criminal cases tend to be higher compared to those with harsher punishments. Severe penalties often act as a final deterrent for those who might otherwise commit heinous acts. Camargo is a stark example of this phenomenon. Between 1990 and 1991, a serial killer wreaked havoc in Texas with a highly distinctive method of murder, so unique that no other killer could replicate it. He had an obsessive fascination with human eyes, especially those that were beautiful and attractive. This morphed into a pathological hobby. He would seek out sex workers with beautiful eyes, shoot them, and then remove their eyes. His anatomical skills were exceptionally advanced, surpassing even those of some doctors. Not all doctors are trained to remove the drooping optic nerve and all 6 major muscles connecting the eye to the eye socket without damaging the eyelid. As a result, he was dubbed the Eye Killer. His name was Charles Albright, a serial killer from Dallas, Texas. On December 18, 1991, a jury deliberated and found Charles Albright guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of Shirley Williams, Mary Lou Pratt, and Susan Peterson. Until his death in 2020, everything about Charles Albright remained shrouded in mystery. But what exactly happened in 1990? What was his background? How did he acquire such advanced skills? And why was he so obsessed with beautiful eyes? In most cases, serial killers are brutal and poorly educated individuals driven by their own twisted motives. However, Charles was described by community neighbors and friends as charming and polite. One of Charles's friends said, "Believe me, if he were really a psychopathic killer, he wouldn't be able to keep it a secret, right?" Charles Frederick Albright was born on August 10, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas. His biological mother, an outstanding law student, was only 16 years old when she secretly married another student and became pregnant. When the girl's father discovered this, he demanded that she annul the marriage and put the baby up for adoption, or he would throw her out of the house. Consequently, shortly after Charles's birth, his biological mother sent him to an orphanage. At 3 weeks old, Charles was adopted by a young, dark-haired woman named Della Albright and her husband Fred, a grocer from Dallas. They lived in Oak Cliff, a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood on the other side of the river from downtown. At the time, it was a beautiful residential area. Della was very fond of Charles, raising goats in the backyard so he could drink goat's milk, which she believed was better for him than cow's milk. However, she could also be a strict and suffocating mother. When Charles was under a year old, she would lock him in a dark room as punishment for chewing on her tape measure. If he refused to take naps, she would bind him to his bed, and if he refused to drink milk, she would hit him. In fact, people in the community often talked about Della's strange and gloomy personality. Although she and Fred were not poor, she was notoriously frugal at mealtimes, even picking up old bones discarded by the local butcher to make soup. Despite her peculiar methods of punishment, her friends claimed it was simply because she had never raised a child before. Charles himself recognized how eager she was for him to succeed. Every morning, before the school bus arrived, Deli would make him practice the piano for at least 30 minutes. She taught him so much reading, writing, and arithmetic that he skipped 2 grades in elementary school. Charles was a talented boy, capable of almost anything, from playing the piano to naming all the constellations. He even performed tap dance at the famous Texas Theater. When Charles was 11, Dele introduced him to taxidermy, bought him a gun, and helped him kill small animals. She even demonstrated how to use various tools: a knife for cutting skulls, a small spoon for scooping out brains, an anatomical knife for removing eyes from their sockets, and tweezers for extracting eyes. She even skinned his first bird and taught him not to cut too deeply. Charles, fascinated by taxidermy, took a course on it, practicing the art of dissection and skinning. An essential part of taxidermy is removing an animal's eyes and replacing them with glass eyes to ensure the specimen's long-term preservation. On one occasion, Charles spent hours perfecting his taxidermy work to make it look as realistic as possible. During the final touch-up phase, he would visit a local taxidermy shop to select a pair of perfect eyes. He loved gazing at the boxes filled with ornate fake eyes: owl eyes, eagle eyes, deer eyes. He admired their rainbow-like sheen and wished he could collect them like other boys collected marbles. However, Deli wouldn't let him do this because the eyes were too expensive. Instead, she would open her sewing kit, find a few buttons, and begin working. Then she and her son would place the birds in the oak cabinet in front of the house. These birds had no eyes. Instead, 2 dark buttons were sewn where their delicate feathered faces met, each appearing dull under the living room light. This childhood deprivation led Charles to develop an unusual obsession with eyes. Subsequent psychologists theorize that this intense desire for eyes drove Charles down a criminal path. Despite Charles's good performance in school, he began delving into crime in his teens. At just 13, he had already been charged with theft and serious assault, marking the beginning of his criminal career. By the age of 17, he was caught as part of a student theft gang that broke into 3 stores and stole hundreds of dollars worth of goods. His adoptive mother, Dele, went to the store owners to try to compensate for the stolen items and attempted to persuade the judge to let her represent Charles as his lawyer. She even offered to serve his sentence in his place. Nevertheless, the boy was sentenced to a year in prison, spending his 18th birthday behind bars. Meanwhile, Dele worked hard to keep this matter hidden, so much so that no one in her community knew that Charles had become a convicted felon. After his release, Charles attended Arkansas State Teachers College in Conway, Arkansas, majoring in pre-med with the intention of becoming a surgeon. During his time at college, he quickly became one of the most popular students. He was very well-rounded, serving as the president of the French club, the business manager for the yearbook, a member of the school choir, and a halfback on the football team. However, Charles was not just seen as a good student. On one occasion, he broke into a physics professor's office during the day, pried open the lock on his cabinet, stole the physics exam papers, and then ran downtown to make a copy. He returned the papers to the cabinet within an hour, while the professor, teaching in a nearby classroom, remained completely unaware. Charles's love for mischief damaged his reputation. He received poor behavior grades for shooting rubber bands around school and climbing out of the study hall. He would even set fire to his chemistry teacher's skirt out of boredom. He then began dating a charming young English major, Betty Hurst, and planned to marry her. He excelled in science. Despite barely studying, he earned an A in human anatomy. People at the school said Charles had a promising future. He even talked about attending medical school to become a surgeon. However, Charles did not abandon his adolescent penchant for theft. During his first year at college, he broke into a girl's dormitory and took some nude photos. He even cut out a friend's ex-girlfriend's pictures and pasted them onto another girl's photos and his own wall. He then manipulated a girl into giving him the keys to the entire campus. After he was caught with stolen items, he was expelled from the college. Charles believed that despite his expulsion, he should still earn a degree. Therefore, he forged a degree using stolen documents and fake signatures to create fictitious bachelor's and master's degrees. Charles also married his college girlfriend and had a daughter. Betty Hurst worked as a teacher. In 1961, Charles was arrested for receiving and concealing stolen property, though no charges were filed. In 1968, he forged certificates of excellence from Arkansas State Teachers College and used them to apply for a high school teaching position. Charles's students found him charming. During field trips, he could fluently recite the scientific names of every plant he encountered in Latin and discuss every insect he found in a rotting log. His teaching career continued until the principal discovered that Charles's degrees and teaching credentials were fake. Consequently, Charles was sentenced to a year of probation for falsifying official records. In 1974, Charles divorced his wife. In 1981, following the death of Charles's mother, he sexually harassed the daughter of a neighbor. He pleaded guilty and received probation for the offense, but later Charles claimed he was innocent and only pleaded guilty to avoid trouble. In 1985, Charles fell in love with a woman named Dixie Austin, a beautiful and shy widow he met during a trip to Arkansas. This was one of the most romantic periods of his life. He arranged elegant dinner dates for her and captivated her with stories about art and nature. After confirming their relationship, Charles soon moved in with Dixie. Dixie was wealthy and financially supported Charles, paying all his bills. On the morning of December 13, 1990, the body of a woman was discovered in a remote, nearly forgotten, low-income area in South Dallas. The woman, weighing 156 pounds, was found naked except for a t-shirt and a bra pushed up over her breasts. Her eyes were closed, and her face and chest bore severe bruises. A police officer at the scene immediately recognized the woman as 33-year-old Mary Pratt, a seasoned sex worker who worked at the Star Motel in Oak Cliff. It was unusual for a sex worker to be murdered, especially someone as well known as Mary Pratt. Mary was not the type of sex worker who openly solicited on the streets. She rarely had extra money, and what she did have was usually spent on drugs. She never bought sexy clothes. This murder was a body dump case, one of the most difficult types of murder to solve. The victim was killed in one location and dumped in another. There were no witnesses, no murder weapon, almost no forensic evidence, no fingerprints, and no obvious motive. The Dallas County Medical Examiner's report indicated that Mary had been shot in the back of the head with a .44 caliber bullet, which was the cause of death. Her eyes were also missing, as if a surgeon had precisely removed them with a scalpel. In the wake of such a shocking incident, the Dallas County Police urgently contacted the FBI. The agency maintains a database of the most heinous murders across the country. However, an FBI agent reported that there were no records of such a brutal murder in the database. The Dallas County Police subsequently launched an investigation, but it yielded no breakthroughs. Due to the lack of leads, the case was temporarily shelved. 2 months later, on the morning of February 10, 1991, the body of 27-year-old sex worker Susan Beth Peterson was discovered near the location where Mary had died. Like Mary, Susan's body was found almost completely naked. The autopsy revealed she had been shot 3 times. One bullet had entered her heart, another had struck the back of her head, and a third had penetrated the top of her skull. Her eyes had also been surgically removed. Dallas County Police realized that Mary and Susan had both been killed by the same perpetrator, but they could not find any key evidence to identify the killer. On March 19, 1991, the body of another sex worker, Shirley Williams, was found at the Avalon Motel, several miles from the Star Motel. Her body was discovered at 6:20 a.m., just half a block from an elementary school in Oak Cliff. Young students walking to school could clearly see the naked body lying by the roadside. The autopsy report showed that Shirley had a broken nose, facial bruising, and a gunshot wound to the back of her head. Her eyes were missing, and an X-Acto blade's broken tip was found embedded in her right eye socket. The series of 3 brazen murders within 4 months caused a stir in the local community. Since the killer had left no fingerprints at any of the crime scenes, the police faced significant challenges. They decided to focus their investigation on sex workers and their clients. Soon, a startling discovery was made. A friend of Mary mentioned that Mary had served a man named Charles, who had a particular obsession with eyes. On March 22, 1991, at 2:30 a.m., a tactical team of police officers stormed into Charles's home. As Charles was handcuffed and taken away, he remained silent. Dixie, clad in pajamas, stumbled out of bed, incredulously looking at Charles and then at the police. Realizing that the man she loved might have done something terrible, she began to scream. Investigators discovered a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum revolver, several X-Acto knives, and a red-stained condom at Charles's residence. They also found Nazi literature, books about serial killers, and several dolls missing their eyes. Unfortunately, the gun found at Charles's home did not match the weapon used by the Eyes killer in the murders of Mary and Susan. Investigators also did not find any blood-stained clothing, although they did discover socks and underwear soaked in bleach. Additionally, Charles's wife provided garage receipts proving that their car was unavailable during the times of the first two murders. However, investigators found hair and fibers on Charles's blanket and vacuum cleaner that might connect him to the murders. The vacuum cleaner contained hair consistent with Shirley Williams, although there was insufficient hair for DNA analysis with the technology of the time. Based on this evidence, Charles Albright was arrested and charged with the murders of the Eyes killer and Rhonda Bowie, a sex worker murdered in 1988, whose eyes were not removed like the other victims. On December 2, 1991, the trial began. However, the prosecution's case began to unravel. The yellow raincoat Shirley Williams was wearing when she was killed was discarded from evidence, despite having been shown to the jury. A sex worker who had previously claimed Charles assaulted her recanted, stating she had been coerced by the police. Charles's neighbors also supported his claim that the car was unavailable. Due to a lack of evidence, the prosecution heavily relied on hair evidence linking Charles to the three murders. Although DNA evidence also connected him to Rhonda Bowie's murder, the charge was dropped due to his alibi. Ultimately, Charles was convicted of killing Shirley Williams and sentenced to life in prison. His defense's appeal, citing a lack of evidence, was denied. Charles was held at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in Amarillo. According to official sources, he remained fascinated by human eyes and was very interested in news reports about eyes being removed or gouged. The 6 missing eyes have never been found, with some speculating that Charles might have eaten them. Charles passed away in 2020 at the age of 87. In modern forensic science, an important theoretical basis is the Locard's exchange principle, which suggests that when a crime occurs, there will be some material exchange between the suspect, victim, and surrounding environment. This can be active, such as stealing a victim's wallet, or passive, such as inadvertently leaving footprints. The police's task is to find evidence of these material exchanges to apprehend and charge the suspect. This series of murders closely aligns with the Locard's exchange principle. On August 28, 1999, in Manchester Prison, a young man suspected of being a serial killer hanged himself. He made a noose out of a bedsheet and hung it from the iron bars of his cell window, choosing without hesitation to end his life in this way. Before his suicide, he wrote a letter. In it, he expressed to his mother that he could not rid himself of the obsession with killing. The letter read, "I couldn't take any more of feeling like how I do now, always wanting to kill." This young man had once told a doctor in the prison hospital that every night, as he lay in bed, he would think about murder. After his arrest, he had already attempted suicide by overdosing on medication, but he was resuscitated in time. As a result, he was placed in the prison's healthcare ward to prevent further suicide attempts. 2 days before his hanging, a staff member discovered that he had a sharpened toothbrush and had fantasized about kidnapping a female staff member, but he did not succeed. With his successful suicide, he avoided being tried for the murders he was accused of, which included the killing of 3 elderly people in Blackpool and 2 other murders on the Isle of Man. This young man's name was Stephen Oladimeji K. Akinmurele. On March 16, 1978, Akinmurele was born in Nigeria. He was of mixed race, with a Nigerian father and a mother from the Isle of Man in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, his family was not harmonious, and growing up in such an environment, Akinmurele felt deeply repressed. He tried to mediate between his parents, but his efforts were in vain. When his parents eventually separated, he moved with his mother to the Isle of Man. Upon arriving on the Isle of Man, Akinmurele's mother, needing to earn a living, left him in the care of his grandmother. His grandmother was a very strict person, imposing rigid discipline on him, and even simple relaxation was not allowed. As a result, Akinmurele lived in constant fear and anxiety. In this stifling environment, Akinmurele's mental state became increasingly fragile, and his mind started to become unstable. At the age of 11, Akinmurele began to show violent behavior toward elderly people, such as verbal abuse, pranks, and intense hatred. This pathological hatred seemed akin to a mental illness. Even though Akinmurele often got into trouble at school, he appeared very friendly to his peers and others. It was only toward the elderly that he displayed a strange and hostile attitude. After these incidents, Akinmurele's mother realized her son had severe psychological issues. She decided to remove him from his grandmother's care, quit her job, and began spending every day with him, just to try and help him live a happier life. In May 1995, the body of a 72-year-old elderly woman, Marjorie Ashton, was found in her home in Ballasalla on the Isle of Man. The cause of death was strangulation. In February 1996, a 68-year-old woman, Dorothy Harris, who was partially blind and deaf, died in a fire at Glasson Terrace on the Isle of Man. By 1996, Akinmurele had turned 18 and moved to Blackpool, one of the UK's most popular seaside resorts. At this time, Akinmurele found a job as a civil servant. He worked hard, even taking on a part-time job at a local pub. During the day, he organized documents at the welfare office, and at night, he worked as a bartender. Akinmurele even started dating a woman named Amanda Fitch. However, due to the psychological issues stemming from his childhood, Akinmurele secretly associated with vagrants and drug addicts. He enjoyed mingling with them and soon became addicted to alcohol and drugs. He also developed a habit of stealing and would give the stolen items as gifts to Amanda Fitch. Although Akinmurele appeared to be living a normal life with his girlfriend on the surface, deep down he harbored violent and murderous impulses. In September 1998, a 75-year-old woman, Jemima Cargill, died in an apartment fire on Cont Street in Blackpool. Due to the destruction of evidence, most people believed she might have died from smoke inhalation during the fire. She had previously been Akinmurele's landlord. On October 30th, 1998, an elderly couple, Eric Boardman, 77, and his wife Joan Boardman, 74, were found dead in their home. Their bodies were discovered by their daughter. Eric's body was found next to a closet in the hallway, and when the police moved his body, they found a blood-stained metal rod on the floor. This metal rod was crudely assembled from 6 batteries and white tape. Joan's body was found in the living room with no visible signs of injury. The autopsy revealed that Eric had sustained injuries to his head, neck, and face, while Joan only had injuries to her neck. Both were determined to have been strangled to death. Based on the investigation, it is believed that on the day of the incident, the sequence of events likely unfolded as follows. The killer had secretly entered the Boardman's home in advance and remained hidden, unnoticed by the elderly couple. The next morning, when Eric left the house, the killer found Joan resting in the living room and strangled her from behind. When Eric returned home, he discovered Joan lying in the living room with the killer nearby. Mistaking his wife's condition as just having fainted, Eric, a husband trying to protect his wife, did not call the police or seek help, but instead bravely confronted the killer. A fierce struggle ensued, but because the killer was armed with a homemade metal rod, Eric suffered severe head and facial injuries and was eventually strangled to death by the killer. Eric Boardman and Joan Boardman were friends in their younger years. Both had been married and divorced, but one day they met again on the Blackpool seafront. They shared their stories with each other, and soon after they got married and spent 27 happy years together. In the 1960s, Eric Boardman was well known in the maritime community in Blackpool, frequently taking vacationers on boat trips along the Field Coast. Joan Boardman was also well known in the neighborhood, always lending a helping hand to her neighbors. Everyone remembered her fondly. She always had a smile on her face and would greet people every morning no matter what. One neighbor said, "I'm really shocked. I just can't believe it. It's so sad." This is a quiet street, and we all knew her well. Joan was a very nice lady. I used to sometimes see her with her daughter in Morrison's or Marks and Spencer, and she would always ask how my mom was doing. She was just a very nice lady. Joan used to give bones to my dog and even put them in the mailbox. She was the kind of person you'd always greet if you saw her. But because of Eric's struggle, the killer's plan was completely disrupted. The killer tried to make their deaths look like an accident by knocking over the closet. If his plan had not been disrupted, he might have started a fire to destroy the evidence. Following an investigation, fingerprints and traces of the killer's blood were found on the metal rod and on Eric's body. Through DNA and fingerprint comparison, the killer's identity was revealed to be Stephen Akinmurele. Stephen Akinmurele, 20 years old, was arrested on November 1st, 1998 on suspicion of murdering Eric and Joan Boardman. However, after Akinmurele's arrest, detectives discovered that Jemima Cargill, who had died previously, was Akinmurele's former landlord. Given Akinmurele's potential involvement, detectives began investigating the cause of Jemima Cargill's death. They found that her case appeared more like a murder than an accidental death. At this point, Akinmurele was charged with 3 murders. As the investigation deepened, detectives noticed similarities between the deaths of Marjorie Ashton and Dorothy Harris with that of Jemima Cargill. As a result, Akinmurele was charged with a total of 5 murders. Dorothy Harris's brother, Ted Halsall, stated that he had no doubt Akinmurele was responsible for his sister's death. While in custody, Akinmurele also confessed to another murder. He claimed that he had killed a hiker on the Isle of Man and buried the body on a cliff overlooking the sea. Following a search, the Manx police found a gun with Akinmurele's fingerprints, but despite extensive excavation, they did not find the hiker's body. Detective Superintendent Bob Denmark, who led the investigation, said, "I personally interviewed him, and I believe he is one of the most dangerous individuals I've ever encountered. I was always concerned about his tendency to kill and the risk he posed to others, whether in custody or not." While in prison, Akinmurele was questioned by several experts, including doctors and a psychiatrist. According to the psychiatrist who evaluated Akinmurele, he said he felt disturbed by images of the victims, which constantly played in his mind. He must have gained some emotional gratification from it. Murder is not a spontaneous crime. He selected his victims. I do not believe he was mentally ill. The evil within him took over. But he was clearly a troubled young man. This was pure violence against elderly women, with each of them being strangled, a very intimate way to kill. The killer witnesses life leaving the victim, and the victim can see the eyes of the person who is taking their life. In July 1999, Akinmurele overdosed on medication but was promptly taken to the hospital. There, he told doctors that the souls of his victims were haunting him and tormenting him continuously. His girlfriend, Amanda Fitch, had warned the police about his strong suicidal tendencies. She said, "Akinmurele told me he wished the police had never found him. He didn't want to face trial." On August 28, 1999, just a few days after being returned to prison and weeks before his trial was set to begin, Stephen Akinmurele hanged himself in his cell. In his suicide note, he confessed to all the murders. He explained his reason for suicide. "I cannot continue to live with this constant urge to kill. I know it is wrong, but I cannot rid myself of it. I cannot continue down this path that I know is wrong, but I know that if given the chance, I would kill again. I do not want to live with this madness any longer, so I must say goodbye to everyone." In the letter, he also confessed to 3 additional murders of young people. However, the police were skeptical of this confession, claiming it was an attempt to obscure the fact that all his known victims were elderly. A family member of one of the victims said, "When we heard about his death, it was more comforting than anything else. The comfort comes from knowing that it's truly over and our family did not have to endure the trauma of a court case. We did not want to know whether he could have been back on the streets in time. We feel sorry for his mother, but from our perspective, I think relief is the best word to describe our feelings." There is a strong possibility that this case has other interpretations. For example, Akinmurele might have been framed due to his mental illness. In all the news reports, or from people who knew him, there was no mention of him having any diagnosed mental illness, not even from his girlfriend who lived with him every day. However, this is just speculation and cannot be considered as evidence.
On the night of August 11th, 2010, At 10 p.m., at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, an Israeli citizen was preparing to board a flight back to Israel. However, fate took a turn as he faced a severe arrest by U.S. Customs and Police instead of returning home. Elias Abuelazam was born on August 29, 1976, in Ramla, a city in central Israel about 20 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea. He originally lived in a well-off Christian Arab family. Unfortunately, his father passed away during his childhood. When he was about 7 or 8 years old, his mother remarried, and the family moved to the United States. He received a U.S. green card but did not obtain U.S. citizenship. Additionally, Abuelazam had 2 marriages. His first marriage was to Dawn Costello in Virginia in 1997, which ended in separation in 2000 and divorce in 2002. His second marriage was to Jessica Hirth on July 30, 2004, which ended in divorce in 2007. News reports indicate that Jessica Hirth suffered emotional abuse during this marriage. This abuse involved making the individual feel disrespected or worthless through words or actions, using threats or intimidation to control or manipulate the individual, limiting their contact with the outside world to make them feel isolated and helpless, and exerting excessive control over their lives, including decisions about whom they can see, what they can do, and what they can wear. On the morning of May 24, 2010, the tranquility of Flint, Michigan, was shattered by the sound of a police call. Officers arrived on the scene to find the body of 31-year-old David Dwayne Motley in a residential yard. He had been repeatedly stabbed and was pronounced dead at the scene around 6 a.m. Just a week later, at around 2 a.m. on June 21, 2010, 59-year-old Emmanuel Mohammed met a tragic fate at the corner of Wood Street and B Avenue in Flint, where he was found dead. At this stage, police had not identified any suspects and had not suspected that these deaths were connected or the work of a serial killer. However, on July 4, 2010, a 20-year-old white male was attacked by an unidentified assailant in the 900 block of Vermillion Avenue in Flint. In the early morning of July 12th, a 29-year-old black man was attacked near Saginaw Road on Maple Avenue in Burton, a few miles east of Flint. A week later, on July 19th, in Genesee Township, northeast of Flint, 49-year-old white male Richard Buck was brutally attacked on North Saginaw Road and Julia Avenue at around 1:30 a.m. while on his way to a nearby store. According to news reports, Buck recounted that a man standing next to a green Chevrolet Blazer asked for his help in opening the vehicle's hood. As Buck was assisting, he was viciously attacked by the assailant, who wielded a Bowie knife, stabbing him in the kidneys and liver, and then strangling him. Buck described the attacker as a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing. He was trained and knew where to stab to kill you, Buck said. Buck later told ABC News that his back and abdomen required 68 staples to close the wounds and that he had deep cuts on his arms from trying to protect his face from the attacker. "I have never been so injured in my life or been so close to death. I was about to die," Buck said. He strongly rejected the idea that the stabbing was racially motivated, believing instead that this guy was just a cold-blooded killer. On Friday, July 23, 2010, just 4 days after the previous stabbing incident, another victim was attacked. This time, the victim was a 21-year-old black man who was assaulted by the assailant at 5:45 a.m. in the 100 block of University Avenue in Flint. 3 days later, on Monday, July 26, 43-year-old Darwin Marshall was stabbed at 1:25 a.m. in the 800 block of Garland Street near West 5th Avenue in Flint. Unfortunately, he died shortly after being discovered. Darwin Marshall lived in an apartment in the north with his mother and another relative. He enjoyed singing with the congregation at the Ruth Street Church of God, which was founded by his grandfather. His mother, Velma Marshall, mournfully said, "It was a melody, and if he sang something for you, he would get your attention. He had a beautiful angelic voice. He was wonderful. I say this not just because I'm his mother, but because he was a wonderful person, and many people loved him." After the July 26 attack, the serial killer seemed to go into a frenzy, initiating almost daily attacks. The following day, July 27th, 26-year-old Antwain Marshall was stabbed at 3 a.m. on Pearson Street near Fleming Road in Flint. He described a terrifying experience similar to Richard Buck's, with similar wounds and 6 stab wounds to his abdomen and chest. He recalled that he was on his way into his apartment when a man approached him asking for help with a car. As he lifted the hood, the man took out a knife and stabbed him. On July 28th, a 19-year-old black man was stabbed at 3:30 a.m. on Cook Street, also in Flint. On July 29th, a 59-year-old black man was attacked at 6 a.m. at Saginaw Road and 12th Street. On Friday, July 30th, 2010, the serial killer attacked 2 victims on the same day, one in Flint and the other in a nearby town. The first victim was 60-year-old Frank Kellybrew, who had been laid off by General Motors and was staying at a local motel. Kellybrew's body was discovered by a passerby in front of the Italian Garden restaurant, located on Miller Road near Lennon Road, not far from the motel. Recent groceries were found near his body, and police estimated that the attack occurred around 3:30 a.m. Motel manager John Henson recalled seeing Kellybrew walk across Interstate 75 to a convenience store to buy some items. Henson said, "He was a good person. He kept to himself. If he didn't know you, he would avoid you and wouldn't bother you. He liked to sit on a bench near the Italian Garden in the evenings just to relax, and he made no noise when the stores closed." According to Henson, Kellybrew had been staying at the motel every month since September 2009. Homicide investigators determined that the last sighting of Kellybrew was walking west on Miller Road near Interstate 75. The second victim of July 30th was not identified, but was described as a 28-year-old black man who was attacked around 6 a.m. at an undisclosed location. On the morning of August 1st, 2010, 2 new attacks occurred. At 2:30 a.m., 17-year-old Edwin Wilson was assaulted, and a 25-year-old black man was stabbed at 6:15 a.m. in the 300 block of Bradley Avenue. Injured and hospitalized, Edwin Wilson complained that it took several days for the police to visit him in the hospital and ask about the attack. He said, "I wondered why Flint police didn't come and ask me anything that night." Police responded that their policy is not to speak with victims immediately after surgery. There were no further stabbing incidents in the following 2 days. On August 3, 2010, 49-year-old Arnold Miner was found murdered less than a mile from his home. He was killed during an attack while walking home after visiting his mother's house on the north side of Flint. Arnold Miner was the second member of his family to be murdered. His sister had been killed 26 years earlier, and her killer had never been caught. Arnold Miner's relative, Kareem Miner, said, "We cannot lose another family member to an unsolved mystery." In response to Kareem Miner's statement at a press conference attended by Flint Mayor Dane Walling, Police Chief Alvern Locke, and Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton, Walling said, "We will catch this person." Despite the ongoing investigation into each attack in Flint, it wasn't until after Miner's death, approximately 2 months into the attacks, that police realized the violence throughout the summer was more than just a coincidence. Many surviving victims provided similar descriptions of the assailant: a white male, between 5 feet 11 inches and 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighing 180 to 210 pounds, with light-colored hair, a goatee, and a muscular build. Some witnesses reported that the suspect drove a dark green Chevrolet Blazer with brown trim, a model year between 1995 and 2004. Given that most victims were African American, the NAACP expressed concern over the handling of the case and was particularly shocked that the attacks were not made public until August 3rd, 2010. The Flint branch president asked a reporter, "Why didn't we know about this? We didn't know there was someone out there stabbing black people. If this were happening in another community, they would be warned." Some Flint victims stated that they would have been more cautious if they had known a serial killer was among them. Police responded by explaining that, apart from unrelated street violence in Flint, there were few leads early on, and Flint was struggling with unemployment and economic difficulties. Despite the vigilance of Flint's police and citizens, a similar attack occurred in Leesburg, Virginia, a small town near Washington, D.C., about 600 miles southeast of Flint. The first victim was 15-year-old Anthony Cage Jr., who was out for a run near his home around 9:30 p.m. on August 4th, 2010. A driver of a passing vehicle got out, approached the unsuspecting teenager, and stabbed him. Cage's mother, Virginia Scott Bay Cage, reported that after feeling pain, her son turned around to see the attacker running back to his car. Doctors found that Cage's liver and kidneys had been pierced, but fortunately, he survived after a 3-hour surgery. The next day, a man driving a green Chevrolet Blazer was stopped near Arlington for a traffic violation and briefly detained due to an outstanding warrant. When his vehicle was impounded, police found a knife and a hammer inside. The man was identified as 33-year-old Elias Abuelazam, a legal resident from Israel. After being released on bail, Abuelazam's vehicle was returned to him. At this point, Virginia police had no idea that Abuelazam was the perpetrator behind the attacks from the past few months. That evening, after Abuelazam was released by the police, a 67-year-old man was stabbed outside his apartment. Despite losing a kidney, the man survived. The next day, August 6, 2010, a 19-year-old man was struck in the head with a hammer by a stranger who had asked him for help. The young man managed to escape before the attacker could hit him again, possibly due to the relatively minor nature of his injuries. Among the 3 victims in Leesburg, 2 were black and 1 was a Hispanic teenager. Each victim was able to provide similar descriptions of the attacker and his vehicle, matching those provided by Flint police. As the police began to piece together the information, Abuelazam was included on their list of suspects. On August 7, 2010, 59-year-old church custodian Tony Leno was stabbed around 7:45 p.m. Leno later told police that a tall, muscular white man stopped his car near him and asked for directions before attacking him with a knife. Leno was stabbed twice in the abdomen before he could react. Fortunately, he survived, but the attacker fled the scene. On August 11, 2010, investigators visited a party store named Goldwater Market near Flint, Michigan, where Abuelazam was employed. He had been working there since July 5, 2010, and was hired by the store owner, Abdullah Farah. Due to his tall stature, he was known in the store as Big Guy, and others referred to him as Eli. Abuelazam, who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed around 230 pounds, drove a green SUV similar to the one described in many of the attacks. Reports indicate that Abuelazam told Farah he needed to take leave to go to Virginia. Investigators noted that the attacks in Leesburg began shortly after Abuelazam left the party store. From a store customer, Edward Gaines, investigators learned that Abuelazam showed Gaines injuries on his hands and claimed they were from a fight. An African-American colleague, Corky Caldwell, told investigators that he did not sense any racial hostility from Abuelazam. Caldwell stated, "If he were the killer, he would have killed me. But there was no sign of violence in him. He couldn't be a racist because all the black people come here at night. I never saw any sign of madness in him." Less than 24 hours after receiving information about Abuelazam working at the party store, investigators worked through the night and spoke with his relatives, discovering that Abuelazam was at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. On the evening of Wednesday, August 11, 2010, they located him at the airport. Abuelazam was waiting at the gate for a flight to Tel Aviv, Israel. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials, assisted by investigators, used the airport's intercom system to call Abuelazam to the ticket counter. Upon reporting to the counter, Abuelazam was arrested by Border Patrol agents. He was charged with attempted murder in the attack on Antwain Marshall and was held in Fulton County Jail awaiting extradition hearings. When FBI agents arrived at Marshall's home at 3 a.m. that day, Marshall identified Abuelazam from a photo as the man who had attacked him. Based on Marshall's identification, investigators were authorized to detain Abuelazam. The Michigan State Police also seized Abuelazam's green Chevrolet Blazer, planning to process it for possible evidence. Abuelazam was also investigated for an alleged stabbing incident in Israel in 2010. Reports indicated that he had stabbed a friend during an argument. However, the case was dropped when Abuelazam's friend refused to press charges. On August 13, 2010, Abuelazam waived his right to contest extradition to Michigan. He flew to Flint on August 26, 2010, and was detained in Genesee County Jail. According to Genesee County Sheriff Robert Pickell, Abuelazam was kept in solitary confinement, possibly for his safety and due to the nature of his crimes, which had taken many lives. At a preliminary hearing for the Arnold Minor murder case, the judge ruled that evidence from other Genesee County attacks could be used in the trial. The trial began on May 8, 2012, with key evidence from the prosecution being a pair of pants from Abuelazam's luggage that had a drop of Minor's blood. On May 15th, the prosecution called 50 witnesses, including other victims and their relatives, several forensic experts, and Abuelazam's uncle. 2 days later, on May 17, Abuelazam's defense introduced evidence of his mental illness. Their sole expert witness was a psychiatrist hired by the defense who diagnosed Abuelazam with paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution countered by challenging the psychiatrist's credibility, noting that his expertise was in addiction medicine. The following day, the prosecution presented 2 mental health experts who disputed the psychiatrist's diagnosis. Both psychologists testified that, despite Abuelazam's personality disorder, he lacked empathy, and his attacks were planned and organized, making him legally sane. On May 22, 2012, after an hour of deliberation, the jury convicted Abuelazam of serial murder and serial assault. On June 25, 2012, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The series of tragic events came to an end with justice being served, but the lives of the innocent victims could not be reclaimed. Their loss remains a deep, enduring pain for their families and the community.